We're just gonna wait till more people get into the Zoom room. All right. Good morning, everybody. We're just gonna wait 1 more minute to let people into the Zoom room. Everybody's doing well. Here in Washington, D.C., it's a very gloomy day. Okay. Thank you for your patience. So, good morning. I'm Susan Aronson from the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub at George Washington University. And we are pleased to have this webinar on 3D printing, which is a very strange technology that has significant potential to increase trade and affect development patterns and could lead to some onshoring. So we're going to talk about that today. And I'd like to welcome our 2 experts, Michele Ruta from the World Bank and Ziyang from the World Economic Forum. So I'd like to welcome them. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you also to our co-sponsors. So we're going to begin. And I'm going to ask the first question to Ziyang, which is, so what are we talking about when we're talking about 3D printing?
Oh, thanks so much, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen. And in the meantime, just a quick disclaimer, I'm here in my personal capacity. My views doesn't necessarily reflect that of my organization. All right, so can everyone see the screen? All right, so 3D printing. So we have a project, we started this project on 3D printing, particularly looking at the policy aspect about a 1.5 years, 2 years ago in cooperation with one of the foreign partners, Mitsubishi Chemical, which is one of the world's largest plastic makers. So we really are curious at what is 3D printing, not only that, but also what are the policy implications of 3D printing? So also not a quick disclaimer, I'm a lawyer by training, so I started looking at this by talking to folks and research, so don't pretend to be an industry expert, but happy to share. So I think it's important to set the scene of what is 3D printing, because I think a lot of the, to lay the base for a lot of things we'll be discussing later on. So 3D printing, also a lot additive manufacturing, a lot of folks use them interchangeably, but 3D printing is more so the technology. So we call it, so what is quite different is from the traditional, if you look at the graph on the right, to traditional manufacturing is more subtractive, right? You make the goods and you take the parts you don't need and you end up the final product. Whereas additive manufacturing, or in our particular case, 3D printing, is really layer by layer building of parts. And you can do that by some of the common methods on the market, FDM, which is using the plastic filament, or SLA, which is using a laser to solidify the liquid, right, the resin. So this is what we're talking about at a high level of what is 3D printing. What are some quick benefits? We call the 3 Ws: what, when, and where. You only need to print the quantities that are needed. When, you can make them just in time, and where, you can print them close to consumption instead of shipping them from far away. Particularly, I think, Susan, maybe one of the reasons we're talking about 3D printing right now is that during COVID, 3D printing got a lot of press. There's a lot of spotlights shot on 3D printing. One example many of you have probably heard was that in Italy, the hospital ran out of this valve for the ventilator. and they couldn't get, because it was during sheltering in place, they couldn't get the replacement in time. And a startup helped them to 3D print the valves and to work on the ventilator and really helped to save lives. Of course, that raised some other issues regarding IP, which we can mention later. So quickly on the current and future applications, what are 3D printing being used right now? Prototyping is a major use case, both in the manufacturing and also in labs, in schools, etc. In tooling, in customized parts, dental aligners, hearing aids, with Michele will be talking about, I'm sure. And the market is also growing. For example, fab labs are popping out in many parts of the world. Future application for digital manufacturing, even larger scale mass customization, 3D printing buildings, where we actually seen that quite a bit recently, or even bioprinting, which is another new frontier. Oh, excuse me.
Can you explain what a fab lab is?
Oh, those are just small laboratory, you call them labs, but basically small entities that are set up, more like distributed manufacturing, where instead of like one centralized place where fab labs are distributed around the different places that can respond to consumers faster. So, so this is one thing I want to really mention, and is that we've been talking about 3D printing. The technology actually has been around for 30+ years, so it's important to know. And it's been growing really fast in the past years or decades. However, what's really important to know is that, and this is figures from 2018, is that the global revenue of 3D printing 2018 is 9.8 billion. And the global manufacturing revenue is 12.8 trillion. So the 3D printing is less than 0.1% of the global manufacturing revenue. So that is important to see the big picture of, when we're talking about the implication of 3D printing on trade and this and that. Whatever your view is, it's important to know how big 3D printing is in the global manufacturing space. Of course, we hope that the adoption vary. Hope I really like the technology. I've been using that to print a lot of gadgets on my desk and either cufflinks. So I really hope 3D printing takes off. The adoption projections vary. Depends on who you talk to. But I think for the industry, 1% by 2030 is an optimistic target. So there's some, of course, challenges from the technical side, from manufacturing side, and also from policy side, which hope we can discuss more in details. And lastly, the impact for trade, which we will be talking this in more detail. So I'll just stop sharing from here. Hope that provides some high-level background on what is 3D printing, what are some of the benefits, and what size it in the global manufacturing overall revenue that laid a foundation for our discussion later today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, Michele, could you talk a bit about how 3D printing is changing trade and comparative advantage in development and the specifics of your paper?
Yeah. So hi, Susan. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Happy to be with Ziyang too, who is much more of an expert on 3D printing than I am. So let me start with the issue of the impact of 3D printing on trade. There is a conventional view, and the conventional view is that the effect will be to reduce trade, shorten supply chain, reshuffle comparative advantage. This essentially is due to the fact that when we think about what 3D printing is, what Ziyang just explained, the idea is that firms or maybe even consumers will be able to trade just a digital file and use the digital file to print a good or an input that they need. So trade per se will not decline. Obviously, there is this trade in the digital file, but trade in goods or merchandise trade would decline. And based on this intuition, there have been some studies that made pretty grim predictions for world trade. So one such study by Leering and others say that trade would decline by 40% by 2040. And another study by the McKinsey Global Institute was looking at both automation and 3D printing, and they were a bit more conservative, but still the prediction was a decline of 10% in world trade. And here, I guess I'm talking about merchandise trade by 2030. So this conventional view has many elements of truth, but it's also incomplete. And it's incomplete in several dimensions, and I'll discuss others later. But the first point I would like to make now is that it's incomplete because it doesn't take into account that 3D printing is a technological innovation in the process in which goods and inputs are produced. And this will allow to improve efficiency, productivity, reduce production cost, and improve quality of the goods. All these things are associated to an increase and not a decrease in trade. And in fact, if we think in historical terms, other episodes where there have been important technological breakthrough, think of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, or think of the ICT revolution in the early 1990s. Those have been associated to a large increase, not a decrease in trade. So the conventional view says something that makes intuitive sense and is probably right, but then there is also this other aspect. So one is a negative effect, the other one is a positive effect, which leads to the conclusion that the ultimate impact of 3D printing on trade is going to be an empirical question, and data can help us answer it. So one way to do this, and this is what we did in a paper at the World Bank with Caroline Freund and Alan Mulabdic, was to look at products that have been 3D printed, and in particular one product that is hearing aids. And the idea is just to say, well, if the conventional view is correct, we should see that trade in these products has declined, or at least has increased less than other products that are not 3D printed. If instead this sort of productivity channel, this improvement in efficiency channel is relevant, then we should see an increase in trade. And if I can ask to put up, I just have a couple of slides that are non-technical, but I think are useful to illustrate the point. So we focused our paper in particular on hearing aids, and the figure shows why this is an interesting example. So hearing aids is a product that within a relatively short period of time, around 2007, shifted from a traditional method of production to 3D printing. The figure that you see there is for one specific firm that is one of the 6 large producers, but similar transition happened at the same time also for the other large producers. So almost 100% of hearing aids traded internationally were produced using 3D printing. So the idea would be if 3D printing had a negative impact on trade, we should see this in the data after 2007, and hearing aids provide a very good natural experiment. Now, if we go to the next slide shows data from UN Comtrade. So this is simple data. We haven't done anything to it. The dotted line that you see, the dashed line that you see on top, that's trade in hearing aids. Is a 6-digit HS code. And as you can see, around 2007, when the technology was introduced, trade actually increased. And not only it increased, it also increased relative to other products in the same HS2 category and similar products in terms of technology, so other high-tech products, which are the other lines that you see reproduced there. So interesting, it did not only increase around 2007, it is basically the gap then remained stable afterwards. Now, obviously, there are many different explanations. It could be that by chance around 2007, there was not just 3D printing, but there was a large increase in demand of hearing aids globally, which would explain this prima facie evidence. So what we do in the paper is use a couple of statistical techniques in order to try to isolate the impact of 3D printing on trade in hearing aids. And what we find is that 3D printing increased trade in hearing aids by 58% over a period of 10 years. So of the negative and the positive effects that the technology can have on trade, at least for the case of hearing aids, the impact was overwhelmingly positive, most likely because this increase in efficiency really had a boost in international trade. Now, obviously, different products could have a different story. So what we did, we took 35 3D printable sectors from another study and tried to do a similar analysis. And the results were pretty much confirmed. So that 3D printing, at least for this larger set of products, had a positive effect on international trade. So let me stop here for now.
Much. So that's interesting. It's both increasing trade and yet it's, we see two different papers saying about the trade effects. One saying it's not going to be that substantial, another using a sector to say that it is substantial, at least for hearing aids. What does it mean for developing countries and development models?
Susan, actually, if I can add a bit to the last question.
Please.
Yeah, so the different views was actually what also prompted us to do our research and start our project, and we published this policy guide. But in the beginning, that was really our starting point too. It's like really like what is the 3D printing's impact going to be on trade? So I agree everything with Michele said. They've done a great job doing the research and with all the data. So from my side, just really quickly, one, as I mentioned at the beginning, we still have to look at the size of 3D printing in the overall manufacturing space. I think that is still a very important indicator. In the future, we don't know. Nobody knows what it will like. But I think just being what it is today and what is going to be the future, I think that's something to keep in mind. And two, I love the hearing aid story. From in our project, what we came across was in a similar example, but this for us was the dental aligners, right? So it's we talked to a top manufacturer of the dental aligners, and well, for me it was super interesting because you go to a dentist's office, you say I want adjustment, they scan your teeth, right? They get this file, and then you go home, days later you receive a package, a box with all the dental aligners one by one, customized, made for you. So you think, oh, okay, they must be, I'm based in San Francisco, so I assume it's somewhere, they probably make it in San Francisco or somewhere nearby in the US. But what we have found from this one manufacturer is that, so when I go to the dentist's office in San Francisco, I scan the whole thing. But then they will actually send a CAD file because it's not perfect. There are places you need to fix, right? And so they would actually send the CAD file to Central America, to Costa Rica in this case. So they have an engineering team there that would help you to fix that, tweak it to make sure it doesn't cut into your gums and all that. And then they would send the file to another country, for example, Mexico, for manufacturing and polishing. So actually, folks told me that 50% of the value 3D printing does is in the post-processing, which means if you, any of you audience, you have a 3D printer, if you print something, it's not perfect. You need to, sand it, you need to make the adjustment. So they go to another country like Mexico to actually print it, the actual dental aligners. Then they ship it back to the US. So that's a perfect example of the trade we're just talking about. Not necessarily will go down. And last thing, just really quickly, but on the other side, maybe not necessarily the 3D printing product, but the raw materials. Maybe that will also the increase in trade of that, because there might be a need for more raw materials instead of the final manufactured or completed product. So the picture is definitely more nuanced. So thank you.
Can I just make sure I understand what you just said? So you're saying once the product has been produced, there's probably more value in the back and forth in refining the product. And that requires give and take on IP, on what else?
Yeah, on the labor, on the manufacturing, and later I can also talk about rules of origin, right? The substantial transformation aspect of it. So on the trade policy side, but yeah. So what I mean by once you, for example, you scan your teeth, the product is not finished yet, right? Still have to go through this long process of designing, of manufacturing, polishing, and then it comes to you. So yeah, it's a longer process than sometimes at least people would think. Thank you.
That's really interesting. Okay, it requires us to think differently about trade, right? What about development?
So let me take the question on development. So again, sticking to this contrast between the conventional view and what we argue in our paper at the World Bank. So the conventional view is that 3D printing will have a negative effects on developing countries. The exports of developing countries. The view can be simply understood by the fact that 3D printing allows to save on labor, and developing countries often are labor abundant and export goods that are labor intensive. So the sectors and the products where they have a comparative advantage would be exactly the ones that are at risk. Now, again, here the conventional view has some important elements of truth, but there are also other aspects to consider, which are essentially the fact that it's not just labor costs that are an important determinant of comparative advantage, but there are other important characteristics that depend on the product and how the product is produced. And I think the example that Ziyang was giving with the dental products fits very well. But let me tell you what we found following a similar logic to what Ziyang was saying for hearing aids in our paper. The first finding was that comparative advantage was not reshuffled. Here, this can be a characteristic of hearing aids being a relatively high-tech product. The countries that were large exporters of hearing aids before the introduction of 3D printers were advanced economies: Denmark, Switzerland, Singapore. Those were also the early innovators, the ones that introduced 3D printing first for this product. And so those were also the ones that took advantage of it and saw a strengthening of their comparative advantage. What we also found, though, is that developing countries as a group did not lose out. This in part is due to the fact that there were some middle-income countries, in particular Mexico, China, and Vietnam, that were able to take advantage and expand exports after the introduction of 3D printing.
Thank you very much for that balanced perspective. I have a few questions to ask, but before I do, I want to invite the audience to ask questions. If you could put them in the Q&A, we want very much to hear from you and make sure your concerns are addressed. So we're waiting for you. The Q&A is at the bottom if you don't know how to fill it out, and I'll read your questions out loud. Okay, audience? Okay. Ziyang, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'll say on the developing country side, I think Michele's last point was fantastic, right? I think, you know, when we think about 3D printing, it's not just itself, but it can also have impact on the other production method or just the digital economy generally. One example on the side is that we spoke with the Minister of Education in Sierra Leone. So the president of Sierra Leone is actually a big fan of 3D printing. See, he has a 3D printed model in his office. And the model is that they would use to analyze data, because all the data we see are very 2D, right? they're not 3D, they're 2D. So what in this particular example and many others, but in this example, they collect the data of how far the children have to walk to school in their country, right? And you know, the length varies, but they put that data in a 3D printing model. A 3D model. So use a 3D printer to do that. So it's just very visual, you know, and easy to understand and present and help the policymakers to make decisions. Yeah, this is not about manufacturing per se, but you know, it's almost like a spark, right? It sets off a series of, I guess, inspirations, and folks can take 3D printing and you know, learn more about advanced manufacturing, about data, about digitalization, digital transformation, and it can lead to many also other positive aspects for development models for developing countries. So I just want to cite that because I personally found that was a very interesting example, and we actually wrote an article about it on the forum's agenda blog. So thank you.
Thank you. So someone just asked about the links to the paper, and if you go to the invitation, we actually did link to each of their papers. But if you, so the original invitation does have those links, but we will, we can put it again out for people if they want to. Okay, I have a few more questions, but I'd like to answer those that are online. So here is a question from Michele. Was the amazing success of the hearing aid due to the planets aligned? In other words, it was a hardcore niche opportunity. Is that the requirement for success? And if so, how many of these are there? Michele, can you take that?
Yeah, thank you for...
Michele, please accept my apology for blowing that.
Everyone gets my name wrong, so don't worry at all. Thank you for the question. So two things. The first is that the hearing aids example, because of its fast transition to 3D printing, and its almost complete transition to 3D printing, makes it an excellent laboratory study. So it's a sort of natural experiment that in 2007, for some reason that have to do with the previous technological innovations in that sector, so that led to the transition. But this obviously opens the question whether this is specific to hearing aids, and that's always the case when you decide to do a natural experiment. It's difficult to generalize. One thing, though, that I would say is that in the paper we look at 35 other sectors, other products that other researchers have classified as 3D printable. And the results in terms of trade, the impact on trade, are very similar. So the positive effect dominates the negative effect that is implicit in the conventional view. So I would tend to say, based on this, that the niche opportunity that was referred to in the question is probably not true on average. So that on average, the positive effects would tend to dominate. But obviously there are many caveats, because these other 3D printable sectors are very different from each other. Not all of them are, actually only a fraction of them are all entirely 3D printed. So there are many, many caveats. But the evidence that we have so far is that the hearing aids is not a niche, it's a story that is more general.
Susan, you're muted.
Thank you. Huh. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so are there other technologies besides 3D printing, such as the huge increase in AI, that could have a bigger impact on competitiveness and trade of developing countries? That's an opinion question.
I can try to take a crack at it. The 3D printing project is actually one of our projects under the big umbrella. We call it Trade Tech, which is looking at how technologies, especially emerging technologies, are impacting trade. Because I'm based in the forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in San Francisco, looking more at emerging technologies. So we did one on 3D printing. We're talking about now blockchain. We have a report on blockchain and how that would impact trade. On AI, that's something on our radar. We definitely plan to look into, but just based on our conversations, I think AI, what we have seen from the industry is that AI is having is really helpful when it comes to optimization, especially in the trade logistics and trade facilitation. So everything from the shipping lanes, right? So that ship don't wait around the harbor to come in, to how do you stack the containers, to how do you unload and load the containers, the goods in the containers, and to the trucks and all that. So I think the AI, there may not use this, but one area we have seen and that we know from the industry is the optimization of the trade processes. So of course, then they have bigger implications on looking at AI generally, right? And what their impact on is on society. But right now, at least for now, what we see is the on the trade logistics and trade facilitation process. Thank you.
Okay. We have more questions.
Susan, maybe one quick point to
Go ahead,
add.
please.
The discussions surrounding 3D printing very often go hand in hand with automation in general and the impact that it has on development. This is not something that I've looked at personally, but the World Development Report that was done by the World Bank last year, the WDR 2020, looked at this issue in particular. My understanding is that when it comes to automation, so the return of the machines, the kind of issues are very similar to 3D printing. The concern is always that this will have a negative effect on labor-intensive exports from developing countries. Up to now, there is not much evidence that this is the case, that this is happening. Obviously, it's possible that with COVID and the increased effort into adopting this kind of technologies, there is an acceleration. Obviously, policies could play a role in this as well, more than automation per se. But the important thing when it comes to automation, and it was the same logic for 3D printing, to the extent that these are technologies that improve efficiency and lead to enlarge the scale of production, then the impact should still be overall on exports of developing countries positive, because it would allow to export more other inputs that are not the ones that are subject to automation or 3D printing. So people should remember this other channel. And actually the WDR 2020 talks more extensively about these issues.
That's great. Thank you for those comments. But building on it, we have a question. What would the longer term impact of COVID be on 3D printing and trade? I think you answered that to some extent. You think it's positive. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, the honest truth is that we don't know, but there is an argument around that COVID will intensify the adoption of automation and 3D printing. It's possible. I guess there are technological constraints that industry experts would be able to answer. I don't know the answer, but the economic logic remains more or less what I suggested earlier. So that there are opportunities and risks on the trade side, and this view that I call conventional view that focuses just on the risk aspect brings up an element of truth, but it's incomplete.
Thank you. Ziyang, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think so. Our paper came out in January this year, so that was before COVID. And in that, we actually talk about the impact of 3D printing on global supply chain. As I mentioned, I think there's a trend of a decentralized manufacturing with 3D printing, right? Things can be manufactured a lot closer to the place of consumption, and be more agile instead of a linear. Approach. So then COVID happened, and we saw some examples. I mentioned the printing of the Evolve and all that. So it's almost that, okay, yeah, this is happening. Because when you make those kind of trends or predictions, you don't know whether that's true or not. And you actually, at least in some aspects, we do see that. But to what scale, whether just completely replace or revolutionize manufacturing, I probably it's going to be a very long process. Again, think about the initial numbers I cited about the market size of 3D printing. I think just always important to keep that in mind when you think about those issues. It's still tiny.
It's tiny. Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, and the one input we haven't talked about is data. So someone here has a question about the role of personal data, given that we're talking about hearing aids and dental appliances. Does anyone want to talk about personal data protection and 3D printing, or it wasn't part of the research?
Well, Susan, you're the expert on data, so we'll refer to you. I would say that based on our research, the treatment let's just say it's like any other sensitive PIIs that are being treated. So 3D printing is, at least I didn't see like a whole new separate discussion. So on how to treat either the privacy of the data, the quote unquote the usual issues we face in governing data, and also PIIs are the same in this space.
But are you gonna be writing about that with your overview of tech and trade?
So we have a project on a digital trade on cross-border data flows. So we actually have published several papers and models and recommendations, a set of policy recommendations on this topic. So happy to share those resources with you and the audience afterwards. Great.
Okay, here we go with some technical questions. So bear with me. Section 337, I misspoke, doesn't permit the ITC, to the U.S. International Trade Commission, to exclude infringing digital goods. So given the proliferation of digital imports, are you worried about the current lack of intellectual property protection with respect to those imports? Anyone want to take that on?
I'll try to take a crack at this. So IP protection is definitely something we have addressed in our paper as well, but more from we have a section on legality and safety. So, and IP is one of them. And one thing, and it's actually not drafted, it's drafted by a lawyer who's more familiar on this topic. And what we have found is that when you look at the traditional measures of IP protection, whether it's copyright, a patent, or trademark, they protect 3D printing files in some way, but not completely. For example, when for the copyrights, you can make tweaks to the file, and then maybe it falls outside of the traditional copyright protection. So what some of the recommendations we provided was that trade secret can serve as a can serve as additional layer of protection, encryption and passwords, and also protect design files using the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So that came up in several of our conversations with the industry and legal experts. So I think we just need, it's this new area, but I think we need a more comprehensive tool and to protect, and also, you know, a global regulatory regime that protect, you know, unique products like this. So thank you.
Michele, do you want to add anything?
Yes, actually, I would add, so this obviously, not being a lawyer, it's not an area of expertise, but there is something that I would like to say from the economics point of view. So at the World Bank in the past few years, we have done research on the content of regional trade agreements. And we've been documenting essentially the deepening of regional trade agreements, which means that trade agreements cover policy areas that are not covered by multilateral rules, by the WTO. So they've been expanding the scope, and in many cases, they've gone deeper in terms of having more commitments. So one of these areas is obviously services and intellectual property rights protections, where regional trade agreements are deepening the rules. There was a question on the protection of privacy, data privacy. And so based on our database, 89 countries have provisions that protect data. Most of these 89 countries are industrialized economies. So most developing low-income economies are outside. These can have important implications because if these economies are trying to establish themselves as export platforms for 3D printed products, the absence of these provisions in the regional trade agreements and the absence of the coverage of these policy areas in multilateral rules may create a disadvantage. So I think this, in terms of the risks, this is something to think about going forward.
Okay. I have a tough question for you, Michele, and I'm so glad. This is from our friends at the OECD, and this is something that Thomas and I just finished writing on. So, the WTO has recently been discussing the moratorium on applying customs duties on electronic transmission. What do you think would be the impact of not reviewing this moratorium on 3D printing? Would anyone like to take that? Michele, can we start with you?
Ziyang, actually, I was hoping you would save me.
I see the questions come from Javier's from OECD. Yep. So who's also an expert on this topic. So you know, we all know currently there are discussions. There are different you know, aspects and perspectives on this topic. You know, on the one hand, you know, there's argument that, you know, the custom duties on 3D printing are missing out on custom duties and et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, you know, the arguments are keeping moratorium can lower trade friction cost and et cetera. So I think, you know, it's you know, it's a complicated topic. I'll just maybe, instead of answering the question, maybe I'll ask two questions back in part of the consideration is one, you know, how to keep track of the for example, the CAD files crossing borders on the technical side, how to do that. And can all countries have the technical abilities to do that? That's one. And two, what are some other options that are available? Maybe VAT or sales tax, could that be used as an alternative? So yeah, so I'll just stop there.
Michele, did you want to add anything?
No, thanks. I'll pass.
Yeah, this is one thing we found from our study, which Javier just reviewed, it was how this has just really been key to the debate for 22 years at the WTO. And, you know, redefining how things are made is going to have a huge impact on the ability of developing countries to use customs duties. So you can imagine why some developing countries really want to really want to have some ability to apply them. Okay, a few years ago, GE was sponsoring development of the micro-factory deployment model. Does anyone have any familiarity with that initiative?
Not from me.
Okay. Why do we speak about exporting and trading 3D printed parts when the idea behind 3D printing is to produce the part locally without the need for shipping, thus reducing the carbon footprint and energy needed in transportation? Anyone want to take that on? You mentioned that a little in your remarks, Ziyang, about the carbon footprint.
Yeah. Michele, go ahead. I can share some too.
No, please go ahead. You go first.
Yeah. So in our paper, what we look at is the policy implications for 3D printing, which, you know, we talk about trade, we talk about supply chain, we talk about manufacturing, but legality. But one section is actually on the environment, I think, which is actually quite important aspect of it. You know, how can we grow 3D printing, but in a very environmentally sustainable manner? Right. On the one hand, as a question asked to reduce footprint, because we can shorten that, shorten the shipping, supply chain, etc. But on the other hand, for example, we all have printers, like paper printers, and I'm guilty of wasting a lot of papers when I'm printing, right? And also, I have a 3D printer I play with, and I'm also guilty of wasting product, you know, the 3D printing, because, you know, something goes wrong, like you know, I tried to print this horse and the leg was missing, so I tossed it up, right? So there's actually going to be waste there. But then counter argument is that 3D printing manufacturing, if you've done it right, you actually waste less materials than traditional manufacturing. So I think it just, again, it's like everything we've been talking about today. It's very nuanced. But we do need a policy to encourage environmentally sustainable 3D printing. I'll give a positive example. This year, and actually at our annual meetings at Davos, I came across this startup. They use algae, like in the lake. They collect that and they make that into filament for 3D printing raw material. So it's biodegradable instead of your traditional plastic. And those, they make bowls and plates and stuff, and they look beautiful. So I think those are the innovations we need to encourage, and also need policies to encourage that. Thank you.
Michele?
Yeah, no, I think that the question was rightly a bit provocative. And a couple of thoughts. So the paper that we did studies the impact of 3D printing on trade. And finds a positive effect. You know, trade is not a goal in itself. You know, the goal is always to increase welfare and not trade. So if maybe that create a confusion. The point, though, to make is that it's not necessarily that a reduction in trade, as it seemed to be implied, could be a good thing because things are produced closer to the consumer. The goal is to increase efficiency and increase welfare through increases in efficiency. In some cases, trade is what is needed to, I would say, not in some many cases, trade is what is needed to increase efficiency. And the example that Ziyang was giving at the beginning on dental products, I think made that quite clear. All of that said, it's clearly true that shipping goods and inputs around the world has an environmental cost. And I think we all agree that pricing environmental.
Oop. Did we lose him? Oh, I think we lost him for a sec. There we go. Michele? I think we lost you. Michele? Can you start again? Okay. Well, let me ask one more question about rules of origin. Can anyone talk about how rules of origin might change if 3D printing becomes more influential?
Yeah, sure. I can cover that and wait for Michele to come back. That's, when we talk about trade policy, another aspect is the rules of origin. Where does in the case of 3D printing, where does the substantial transformation takes place, right? If you have two countries, A to B, is clicking the button. So I'm simplify everything here. Is clicking the button and then 3D printing the product. Would that qualify as substantial transformation in this case, or is the actual design of the CAD file, right? But what if the design of the CAD file falls under the PTA countries, we'll say between A and B? What if the design takes place in country C, right? So, and then sent to country B and then to A. And so I think that those are the rules that we haven't fully figured out yet. And it's something that I think for the trade folks, a lot of them on your call, I highly encourage the community to think about that.
Well, just to let you know, in the WTO open papers, there's no discussion of it whatsoever from what we found. Michele, we lost you. So did you want to add anything? Michele?
Sorry, Susan, for some reason I was disconnected and I had to reconnect. So I lost what you said in the past 3-4 minutes. I'm sorry about that.
You were talking about environmental impact and we didn't want to lose. Do you want to summarize what you said?
I don't know exactly when you lost me, but what I was closing with was the fact that it's important to price environmental externality correctly. So that's the point that I wanted to make. So
that came through. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We are going to wrap up now. I want to thank our speakers and our sponsors and invite you to our next webinar, which is going to be on what the U.S. government can do to enhance America's competitiveness in AI. And our speakers will include AI researchers and the Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States, Lynn Parker. So we look forward to seeing you there. Ziyang and Michele, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us about your research, which is truly impressive. And we're counting on you to explain all this to us. And we hope to have you back soon.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's a pleasure.
Everybody.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks for the opportunity. Nice seeing you.
Thank you for your brilliance.